rock.
You will join later. Shall I start? Hello, everyone. So we are starting our panel. So welcome to our conference once again, and welcome to our first panel on European Union enlargement. My name is Alina Nychyk. I'm part of the team of Young Security Conference and the postdoctoral researcher at ETH Zurich. And today we will speak about enlargement. So the strongest mechanism of European Union's soft power, most effective European Union's geopolitical tool, and the best way to transform countries into well-functioning democracies. And enlargement was a bit forgotten, but then in 2022 was resurrected again, and now there are discussions about European Union's enlargement on 8 countries. And we will discuss the possibility, how, when it will happen, on which countries, what are obstacles, what can we learn from previous enlargements. And we have amazing speakers with us. We have Jovana Marović, who is the former Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of European Affairs of Government of Montenegro. And her entire professional academic career is still also devoted to the European integration process of Montenegro and Western Balkans. And online we have Richard Kraemer, who is the president of US-Europe Alliance and formerly senior program officer for Afghanistan, Iran, Turkey at the National Endowment for Democracy. And Richard previously oversaw projects at Center for International Private Enterprise and also taught and researched at Jagiellonian University in Poland. And we have a member of European Parliament from Germany, Viola von Cramon-Taubadel, who is a Green MEP, and she was member of European Parliament since 2019 and previously represented Lower Saxony in the Bundestag. So let us start. You can already start preparing your questions, but I will start with my questions. So let us start from the beginning. How enlargement was resurrected in 2022? Can you please explain why it happened, how you understand it?
Oh, thanks for the invitation and thanks for this hopefully great panel. I wouldn't say that it started in 2022. To be honest, I think it started before. But when the Russian aggression full invasion and the Russian aggression in Ukraine in 2022 began, I think it was obvious for each and everyone that was Ursula von der Leyen stated at the beginning of her mandate that the Commission will be a geopolitical commission, that this needs to be put into action. And of course, I think that the enlargement process had never stopped, but there was a promise given in 2003, so 21 years ago, to the countries of the Western Balkans, that generally the European Union would be open and welcoming them if they apply and if they conduct reforms and if they implement reforms. But to be honest, there was never, I would say, or not really a serious offer. So after a certain period of time, the countries there became rather frustrated. And now with the situation of Ukraine and Moldova, we should not repeat those mistakes, that we raise expectation, but then don't keep our promises. So I would say the geopolitical necessity is obvious. The actors in the Western Balkan regions, such as China, Turkey, Russia, United Arab Emirates, and many others are super active. And it's not somehow in our neighborhood, it's our inner yard. And I think that everyone, in theory, understood that we have to become more active. And that's why I think we came up with the growth plan for the Western Balkans. We came up with, and Jovana can speak more about that, concrete steps, how we can have a more, let's say, step-by-step approach for some of the Western Balkan countries. But what we haven't done and what we haven't managed in the European Union is to do the obligatory reforms within the European Union. And also, we just had a broader debate in Hamburg 3 days ago. And when you speak to the broader public in Germany, there is still a lot of skepticism that this is really a political will from the society, that this is really a good idea, that there is really a monetary use for us in the European Union. And here, I think, in terms of reforming, communication, in terms of convincing people in the member states, I think we have a lot of homework to do.
Thank you very much, Jovana. And what is your perspective? Do you feel this resurrection and movement forward of enlargement in your region, in Balkans?
So, since I'm the only one from the Western Balkans at this panel, I think that my intervention would be probably the most pessimistic one. So I don't see that anything new is happening about enlargement when it comes to the EU's approach towards the Western Balkans, but also candidate countries. Why I'm saying that? Because having war in Europe actually implies, and actually there is a need for more radical reaction from the EU's level. That's the first thing. The other thing is that the European Union offered, as a reaction on that situation, the same tools, and the same focus still stays on economy for the Western Balkans and also for Ukraine, Moldavia and the other candidate countries. The other thing is that from the very beginning, when war started and when there was need for reaction, the European Union was starting to build two enlargement processes, one for the Western Balkans and the other one for the other countries, in first line for Ukraine. Then the other thing is that we have now the growth plan, but the growth plan is the kind of an umbrella for the all existing initiatives so far. So the growth plan is not offering anything new to the Western Balkans. There is this 3-year plan for the Western Balkans with money which is not huge amount of the money, but you know, like novelty is that there are some incentives and sanctions over there, but we still don't know whether it will work in practice. So until now, and the growth plan was announced during the last year, we were waiting for this implementation of the plan for the whole year. You know, with all this happening in Europe and the whole need for reaction and the rest. And then finally, we don't have vision for the Western Balkans and for the candidate countries, because the other way around, there should be political plan for the Western Balkans and for the rest. Why I'm putting always at the first place the Western Balkans, because as Viola said, we are waiting for this for 21 years. So basically, you know, if you are measuring the level of democracy in Western Balkans back then, 20 years ago, and now situation is almost the same. So the European Union is failing to provide democracy and rule of law to the Western Balkans, and we don't see anything new when it comes to the rule of law instruments and democracy instruments in enlargement process. And then finally, I have to say that this whole situation about the safeguarding democracy and keeping enlargement high at the agenda, it have to go hand in hand with the efforts in the European Union. And someone mentioned during the introductory speech about French president speech. The last one was just, you know, a month ago. And he was keeping and repeating all over again that the European Union should be stronger in order to be bigger. And we don't see any kind of efforts to reform the European Union. The European Union is failing to reform itself from Maastricht, you know. So in that sense, I think that what should be the lessons learned from this failing to safeguard democracy and to improve the democracy in the Western Balkans, but also in EU member states, that the European Union should implement the same instruments and same tools both in the EU member states and in the rest, in the candidate countries in the Western Balkans. So I'm not sure whether we are witnessing the momentum in the enlargement process.
Thank you so much. What's your perspective, Richard?
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes, we can hear you.
Great. Just wanted to make sure that the technical efforts were being realized. Thank you very much for having me today, Alina, and to my co-panelists. I'm sorry that I can't be there in person. So I have to largely agree with Jovana that what's been happening has been a lot of lip service, a lot of nice talk vis-a-vis the Western Balkans, and it's while on one hand it's encouraging that the tragedy of the full-scale invasion has led Brussels to actually decide that they do need to make sure that all of Europe is part of a greater democratic institution, that being the European Union. On the other hand, we've seen a lot of talk about this before. And, my colleague Marović and I, back in 2020, through the US-Europe Alliance, had published a paper expressing our dismay about President Macron and his unwillingness to consider North Macedonia and Albania as part of a greater European Union. And, I think that is just sort of indicative of a general attitude going forward that needs to be rejected. And what I've seen in the years since is an increasing focus on Serbia. That Serbia is it's a large country. It's economically it's the largest nation in the Western Balkans, and that this is supposed to be a sort of guiding point. Like, if we can just get Serbia on board, then things are going to be okay. And I disagree with that significantly. My fear is that what may happen is that there's going to be this interest in sort of like, well, once we bring them into the fold, once we bring them into the tent, that we're going to see a better form of behavior. They're going to actually start to accept democratic institutions, and they're going to go forward with, basically playing in line with EU standards. I didn't see that with OSCE from the 1990s through the present. I didn't see that with the WTO vis-a-vis China in the 2000s, and I don't know why it's going to be any different with Serbia. And I do, on one hand, I very much empathize with countries like Montenegro that want to be part of the European Union, but we need to recognize, first and foremost, that people's concerns are primarily economic. And it's not about being a democratic, it's more about we will have access to greater markets, ones that will benefit our families and our communities. So if we're going to recognize that, then we do need to actually, I should say we, speaking transatlantically, that we need to actually push these countries in that direction, but with the recognition that, it needs to be political as well. And, democracy is not just about complaining and actually having your representatives hear you, but it's about giving solutions as well. And I think we need, a bit more of that kind of voice rather than simply kowtowing to those that we hope are going to be more democratic when they actually come into the tent.
Thank you so much, Richard. Let's talk about future. So how do you see the future of EU enlargement, and thinking about elections, EU elections, American elections? So Viola, you mentioned that this commission is geopolitical. Will the next one be geopolitical, and the parliament? How do you see it?
Maybe I pick up the last topic of Richard's comment. The problem is here that not everyone thinks that it is a good idea to bring in Serbia, especially not when it has an autocratic ruler. And that already frames a bit the problem within the Commission. So we have a commissioner for enlargement. He's from Hungary, and he mainly is perceived in the Western Balkan as the right hand of Orban. And Orban tries to undermine the EU foreign policy and enlargement policy as much as he can. And he does that with a lot of ambition, and he really harms the EU. And that is my main concern and my main, I would say, accusation towards the head of the Commission, the president of the Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, that she never stopped him doing so. So what we see in the relation with Serbia, we just see with the relation in the relation with Georgia at the same time. And I mean, it was probably the biggest mistake to give him this whole portfolio for enlargement because he can, or he has harmed and he has given, I mean, funds and money and a lot of praising for Vučić and other autocratic rulers in the region, but also in the case of Georgia, a lot of wrong decisions, a lot of wrong rhetorics and statements and confirmation. So what will happen after the 9th of June? It depends very much on the majorities. It depends very much on how the new composition of the college will look like, who will get which file. I do hope that no matter who will come from Hungary will not be given such a responsible file, such an important file as we have seen for the last 5 years, because with this, definitely there is no coherent approach in enlargement. We need somebody who really keeps up the value-oriented enlargement process, the merit-based process, and not somebody who seeks for allies for Prime Minister Orban, because this is mainly the goal of Viola. When it comes to the parliament, I mean, so far I would say we still have quite a large majority for a merit-based process, for enlargement, for the support of Ukraine, Moldova and other countries. But if this shrinks and if the, let's say, democratic forces will lose significantly, this might change the course of the parliament as such, and that might also harm the whole security and foreign policy. And yes, this combined with the potential re-election of Trump might change the direction of the Western alliance. And I'm generally more pessimistic when I go through the schools in Germany, talking to the youngsters here. They don't have a clue what this would mean if they vote for the AfD, for the right-wing party here. They have no clue what the AfD has in their party program, how they will especially reach out to autocratic rulers, how they will allocate funds to people like Orban and Vučić and others, and that is a big problem. So the majority of the people do not really care about the program of the right-wing parties. So some of them vote for, I don't want to the general parties anymore. That is a protest against the national politics. But this will, I would say, damage the EU decision-making process, and also, especially in foreign and security policy, the enlargement process especially.
Jovana, what is your feeling about future US and EU elections and its influence on EU enlargement?
Just also to add a few lines about Serbia and the position of the US and the EU towards Serbia. According to the new growth plan, amount of money which will be delivered or distributed to Serbia is 1.6 billion. And to Montenegro is 400 million. The criteria is GDP and number of citizens, of course, but it's not the way, you know, how it should be, because the Montenegro is the country which is the closest to the European Union, and so it should be, and it's delivering on the European agenda. Montenegro is fully aligned with the common foreign security policy. Montenegro does not have so far open bilateral issues, and then, you know, you are granting Vučić not to act in accordance with the European agenda and European standards. And this is really the most problematic thing in EU enlargement. I think this is the way how the US and the EU are keeping status quo in the Western Balkans, you know, like keeping Vučić in power, because they had lots of chance to push and to make pressure on Vučić, and they refused to do so. So the most important part of this new growth plan is how the sanctions will be implied if the countries are not delivering. And I think that how it should change after the European elections, I don't see that Europe can go more far right than it's at the moment. You know, lots of countries are already on that position. So I don't also expecting that it will reflect more positive or more negative on EU enlargement. As already explained, EU enlargement is already stuck, you know. So in that sense, I think that for the EU enlargement, the most important thing is which country will hold the EU Commissioner for Enlargement. That's the first thing. So, for example, if the commissioner is coming from France or from Germany, that means that the European Union is really serious about European perspective of the Western Balkans. And also, I think that there are lots of ways, to control this commissioner coming from Hungary in that sense, but they are still, refusing to do so. Because he is going around, he is supporting Vučić, he is supporting right-wing parties in Montenegro, he is doing lots of mess, and our parties are using his statements, just to explain to the public that they are doing everything well. The other thing about, I think I'm more worried about the US elections in that sense, because if the Trump wins, lots of can go in negative way both for Ukraine and war between Russia and Ukraine, and also for the Western Balkans, because our nationalistic parties are really want to see Trump as the president. And as I already explained, the position of the US towards the Western Balkans is already problematic, because they are still pushing for the open Balkans, really controversial regional initiative pushing autocrats to cooperate among themselves. They're also supporting Vučić, trying to explain that they are making pressure on him, behind the closed door, which I cannot, there are not proofs for such position. And then I think if Trump wins, in that sense, we can expect more radical position towards war, Russia and Ukraine, and also situation in the Western Balkans.
Let us ask Richard about US elections. Maybe he has some insights that we don't know.
I don't know if there are necessarily insights that I have that y'all don't know, because everyone is plugged in these days. First, I want to say that before I talk about what I believe is very much like he's going to be President Trump a second time. If you look at the swing states and the polls, and we found that certainly in 2016, the polls didn't necessarily tell us where we were going to be, but public survey opinions were such that, Hillary Clinton was going to be elected, and we've seen Trump become president. We've seen public opinion polls in other countries failing recently. So I can get back to that. But first, I want to echo Jovana's comments about Serbia. And, it's very interesting, Jovana, if I may, that what you've essentially stated is that there's an interest in engaging Serbia to the extent that Brussels and Washington does, because it helps put other Western Balkan countries on the back burner. It doesn't allow them the entrance that they should otherwise have, depending on how democratic their institutions are, because it all depends on Serbia. It all depends on Belgrade. I have argued in numerous publications that Belgrade is essentially a Russian and Chinese proxy, and that is everything from billboards of Xi. It's everything from public opinion polls in Serbia that show that the majority of Serbians actually don't want to be part of NATO and don't want to be part of the EU. Since the full invasion, the extent to which there are a number of Russians that have been able to set up businesses and been able to travel and get around various sanctions that have been put in place, and rightfully so, through Belgrade. And so, last year I had the great fortune of being on this panel, or being on a panel at YSC 2023. And when asked the question by my friend Lana, I said straight up, basically, Serbia is a Russian proxy, and they're an adversary, they're an enemy. And I think that we need to start looking at it like that. I know those are very harsh terms, but what I mentioned in my first remarks were essentially that you can try to bring these states into an organization or into an institution and help they're going to change their ways, and they don't do it. So we need to be more realistic about what is going down, and essentially there's a certain black and white, and that everyone doesn't get to have their cake and eat it too. In respect to the coming elections, I likewise, I share my co-panelists' concerns about a Trump election, at least the impact it's going to have on Europe in particular. Look, Donald Trump is a nationalist populist, and that's essentially what Orban has been working off of. That's what Dodik has been working off of. That is what Vučić has been working off of, and it's played to their end. That's going to be extremely detrimental. And the only cautious optimism that I still have about the prospect of Trump being in the White House and how it relates to Europe is with a few numbers I'm going to share with you right now. So in 2022, we had 5.26 billion worth of exports going to EU states. Between the European Union and the United States of America, we had $9 million jobs that were directly related to that relationship, and 16 million that were indirectly related to that relationship. And then finally, in 2022, the European Union states put $1.4 trillion of foreign direct investment into our country. Now, a lot of that was in stocks, let's be clear, but it wasn't entirely. And what that means is jobs, and jobs means votes in the United States. I've worked in a lot of countries around the world, and I've been very interested to see that people don't always vote for their wallets. However, Americans do. And if Trump begins to see, as my organization seeks to purport, that by not having the best relationship we can with democratic states in Europe, then if that costs American jobs, what that is going to cost is their income and votes. Finally, I'm going to leave it at this. I'm very concerned about the prospect of Robert Lighthizer, who was formerly U.S. Trade Representative, actually being Secretary of Commerce or some other similar cabinet portfolio, possibly Treasury. This is a person who believes that by devaluing the dollar, we're going to make the U.S. economy more attractive internally. Devaluing the dollar is going to lead to more expensive goods and services in the United States. Eventually, it won't be right out the gate, but it's going to happen. And that is going to be bad for the United States because it diminishes our ability to project our influence and our support of our partners. And I'm very fearful that, this thinking that it's not new in the Republican Party, it goes back to the 1920s, that this kind of isolationist, economically and politically, this kind of isolationist thinking is going to be to the detriment of our own interests as well as Europe's, with whom we've had an excellent relationship despite ups and downs over the past 80, 90 years. So that's my take. Thank you very much, Alina.
Thank you. Jovana, you wanted to have a brief comment?
No, just 2 weeks ago there was the summit within the growth plan in Kotor, Montenegro, and they were all discussing, and the president of Serbia, Vučić, he said that public support for the EU membership in all the Western Balkan countries is really high, is around 80%. But in Serbia is 40%, and he was explaining that the European Union is not popular in Serbia. But the thing is that the anti-EU policy is part of the official policy in Serbia. That's the first thing. And the second thing is that Vučić is flirting with all of them, Zelensky's wife was in official visit to Serbia. He is fine with Russia, he is fine with China, he is fine with the EU, and he is interested only in money. And that's all. Basically, and it's fine. I'm fine that Russia is fine with that approach, and China and the rest. But the EU should not be. The EU has instruments to punish Vučić, and they are not doing so. So that's the most problematic thing.
To second that, Alina Zelenskaya was recently together with Dumitru Kuleba, the foreign minister, in Belgrade, and none of the state-governed newspapers, TV channels covered that visit. None of them. So it was not in Vučić's interest to show to the public that the First Lady of Ukraine and the Foreign Minister of Ukraine had visited Belgrade. They have given an interview, I think, to N1, which is the opposition channel, but none of the official, I don't know, Blitz, Informer, Pink, Happy TV, and how they are called, none of them have covered that. That is also a fact.
The Ukrainian newspapers covered it, and I know as agreed for a common summit.
All the time. So what was the point of the visit?
So I wanted to ask my last question, and then we'll open to the public. So please prepare your questions already. So as a Ukrainian, my last question will be about the Russian war against Ukraine and its influence on enlargement. You know, Ukraine is very hopeful about enlargement, and the process is going on. But everybody, from my feeling, everybody agrees that enlargement cannot happen before the war is over. So how do you see this? The influence of Russian-Ukrainian war on enlargement and its future?
Well, what I said at the beginning, this expectation management in general, independent whether the war is still going on or is over, I think is important. So what we have done with the Western Balkan 20 years ago to say that generally they can come at any time, they're welcomed and so on, was super naive. I think with Ukraine we had not repeated that. We have said that it's a merit-based process. These are the recommendations or the conditions of the EU. Please start drafting the legislation, vote on them and implement them. And that's what Ukraine is doing. So far we do not speak about any, let's say, membership or to become close to the membership as such. I think we're still at this stage, and I think it's important to acknowledge that at the end of June we will start the negotiations. Even Hungary tried to block this as well. But there, I think this is an important signal to the Ukrainian government, but also to the Ukrainian public to say, yes, you have done almost everything which was required by the EU, and of course we will start the negotiations. When the membership and when the accession really takes place, I would say it's not only dependent on the war. We have seen that half of Germany entered the European Union and the other half entered later. I can imagine that in the end we will have a similar situation here. I mean, we can speak about security guarantees and everything else, but first of all, it is important to see there is a big unity in the Ukrainian Rada, in the parliament, to make everything possible that all the requirements by the EU are fulfilled. And that is completely different from the situation in many Western Balkan states, to be honest. And not just in Serbia, but also in other states. The lack of reform and the speed of implementation is sometimes super lousy. And here, I think Ukraine has a big advantage. We will see how the military situation will play off in the next weeks and months to come. Unfortunately, we have been lacking all the promises and not just ammunition, but also everything else. So I'm a bit skeptical when it comes to the military situation, but when it comes to the clear enlargement process, to the requirements and to what Ukraine can do, I think Ukraine has done a lot. So here I'm not so skeptical.
So very quickly, do you see it possible for Ukraine to join EU as a full member
not as
with the war going on? Or
not when the war is going on, but what I said is we had a split country which entered the European Union, that was Germany. So I can imagine if we have a situation where Ukraine has not reconquered its entire territory back, has not liberated or not managed to liberate, but was nevertheless part of the European Union. So we see that in Cyprus. We can also maybe see something similar then to Moldova. But of course, the hot war, I'm not so sure how this is manageable. But, and that is the question, if there's no NATO membership, we have to speak about security guarantees. And this is also independent of the situation, whether the war is still going on or whether we have any kind of a frozen conflict in the end.
Thank you. That's a bit of optimism.
I have to say that I'm kind of skeptical when it comes to merit-based approach from the European Union's level. And the issue is that the European Union already reached its limits when it comes to support towards the Ukraine, both in political, economic, and military sense. So I don't expect that something, big will happen when it comes to Ukraine, but it's also important to provide this support, at least on a technical level, on a daily basis. But there was also interesting estimation from President Vučić from the same Growth Plan Summit. He said that no country of the Western Balkans would join the European Union before Ukraine. But for Ukraine to join the European Union, there is a need for lots of institutional reform in the European Union, both in the sense of institutions and also in the sense of certain reform of certain policies, such as agricultural, environment, and it's easier in that sense for the European Union to integrate the whole of the Western Balkans than Ukraine. That's the thing. And then when it comes to enlargement, whether it will happen anytime soon, there are lots of scenarios, and probably like 4 of them. The one is to the European Union to integrate Montenegro, and then the rest to keep in the same, like a status quo situation. The other one is to couple some of the candidate countries and then to integrate, for example, by 2030, Montenegro, North Macedonia, and Albania. The other scenario is actually to integrate the whole candidate countries and all the candidate countries by 2030. But that means that we should have stage-by-stage integration once when there are countries within the European Union, like kind of multi-speed Europe. And in geopolitical sense, this is probably the best case scenario, to integrate all of them, but without rights, but in the sense that, you're like fearing of Russian, Chinese, and the other influence. Once in the sense of European values, and the Europe is rounded, it's easier, to integrate them once when they are inside. And then the fourth scenario is to have status quo, like no country joining the European Union anytime soon. And in my opinion, this is probably the most, this scenario can win, let's say. And when we are discussing, is there alternative to the European integration when it comes to candidate countries, the Western Balkan countries, Ukraine and Moldova and Georgia? The thing is that we are leaving this alternative to the European integration process and the membership in the European Union for 20 years now. The status quo is actually alternative to the European integration process.
Thank you. Richard?
Thank you very much. Jovana, I agree very much with your sentiments. The prolonged wish list of everything that needs to be required for countries like whether it's Montenegro, whether it's Georgia to join the European Union. On one hand, I clearly stated that you need to have genuinely democratic institutions in order to be part, and the idea that simply because you've been granted membership and then things are going to get better, I think we've seen doesn't work. On the other hand, and this is more in line, I think, with what is your perspective, your thinking, is that by letting this go on for so long, it allows for spoilers. And spoilers, whether they're in Serbia or whether in Georgia, it's really not that difficult. With comparatively a fair amount of US dollars, you can turn people out into the streets, you can buy parliamentarians, you can basically, you can provide contracts to those in the private sector that are going to work with Russia or work with China, and they have their interests that are anti-democratic. And so there's a lot of influences that can come in from a variety of venues that will be detrimental. And so I appreciate that, on one hand, that, it's not an easy road to get into the European Union if corruption is something that is widely understood and accepted in your country. On the other hand, it needs to be made clear by Brussels that, like, vis-a-vis Ukraine in particular, that this amounts to treason. I'm going to say that again. This amounts to treason. Because those in Ukraine that want to engage in acts of corruption, they are opening their country up to the Russian influence that is going to be unceasingly focused on pulling that country back into their orbit. Russia has shown for centuries, whether it was the Romanovs, whether it was a Russian nationalistic Soviet Union, or whether it's the contemporary Russia that we know, that what they do is expand, and they are afraid of anyone that has a national identity on their borders distinct from their own. To the extent that those individuals are willing to engage in acts of corruption in Ukraine, what that allows is for Russian tentacles, Russian hands, Russian fingers to get into their country and have influence. And the sooner that we recognize and accept that corruption is not acceptable, in whether it's Ukraine, whether it's Serbia, whether it's Georgia, these countries are not fit to be part of the transatlantic democratic alliance, whether it be vis-a-vis NATO, whether it be vis-a-vis EU. And I know that's, to a certain degree, those might, who are hearing my words, who are actually decision makers, might say, well, it's easier said than done. Like, I get it. But the bottom line is that until we actually start to have these very clear lines about what's acceptable and what isn't, we're going to continue along the road that we've seen in the Western Balkans for the past 20 years, where it's like, okay, maybe you'll be in, maybe you won't, and you'll just play this, like, no, clarity is what's needed. And that's not going to make everyone happy, but you know what? Trying to make everyone happy is a sure way to unhappiness. So, thanks.
Thank you so much. Let's move to the public. Who has a question? Julian will give you a micro. Yeah, I see already one question here.
Yes, thank you for the discussion. You talked about the fact that the EU must materialize its promises on membership, especially for the Western Balkans. So I'm wondering why the growth plan is not formally linked to the accession process. So delivering on the conditions of the growth plan does not impact the process or the progress on the chapters of the accession negotiations, and for me that's not really a sign of credible EU membership perspective.
I would suggest we collect 3 questions and then each of the speakers can address them.
Hi, to Mrs. von Cramon, since I am from Albania and I do know your work, especially as a reporter for Kosovo for Enlargement, I want just to focus once on you and then to Jovana. Why, since Serbia is not in the mood of joining EU or still want to look around for other options, and we have problems in Bosnia and we have problems in Kosovo, mainly because it's not recognized by 5 member states. So do you see, what's your view, how we can move ahead with the other 3 countries, Montenegro, Albania, and North Macedonia, since they are, I won't say more democratic, but comparing to a number of standards, these 3 countries are way much more better than Hungary, some part of Poland, Slovakia. Don't make me start talking about Romania and Bulgaria, even though there is a huge problem of corruption in Germany itself and France, speaking of which. And on this perspective, you are one of the few Greens who speak publicly and loudly about the problem we have with Serbia compared to, let's say, your fellow members from the Green, including the foreign minister in this country, including the special envoy, who usually just cover or do not talk publicly that Vučić is an autocrat. To Jovana, I want also to know, how do you see in your country the fact that you are 500,000 people, roughly half of Munich, and you have been left in the waiting room for so long? What can Montenegro do more to speed up? Thank you.
Anyone else has a question? Oh, there is one person.
Thank you for your interventions. They were really good. Thank you. I'm Anna Poupe. I work in a law firm, DGR Avocats in Paris. And I specialize in the question of enlargement of the EU. And I had a question regarding the point and the objective of the EU and its enlargement policy. According to all the discussion we had today and during the conference, what comes out mostly is that the state candidates must provide a more intensive effort in order to enter the EU, and those efforts are basically compromised by many aspects. But as such, do you believe that the enlargement policy of the EU, its point is truly the enlargement, or more a process to enforce the EU influence in the East, and would be considered a new policy, a new tool in the security and defense policy of the EU, more than an enlargement, properly speaking, policy.
Thank you so much. Who wants to start? You want to start? You can start, okay.
Back in 2014, when Juncker said that there would be no enlargement during his mandate, Germany, France, and the other EU member states initiated the Berlin process. That was the best which they could offer to the Western Balkan countries at that time. And all academics, all scholars, all NGOs, we were discussing all over again whether the Berlin process is alternative to the European integration and to the EU membership or not. We have the same situation at the moment. The EU was obliged to offer something to the Western Balkans, and the growth plan is the maximum which they can offer at the moment. As you said, rightly, the reporting process on the growth plan is completely different from the one within the European integration, and when we are reporting in accordance with the negotiating chapters and the rest. There is completely new strategy or reform agenda for the growth plan for the country and administration, which is already burdened both in the EU, European Commission and the Western Balkans, with lots of reporting, lots of documents, lots of strategy and all the other stuff. They have to produce another reform agenda for the growth plan. And when I try to assess, to see this reform agenda for Montenegro, you have these three pillars which are planned, which the European Commission is planning to integrate at some point the Western Balkans into some areas on the single European market. And these areas are like digitalization, economic and energy transition, and all the other things which are not influencing the rule of law in the country. And the country is all, of course, using the most easiest part of the, for example, Chapter 27, which is related to the environment. The other thing is that the rule of law conditionality within the growth plan, and Montenegro, for example, is repeating the same part which is already part of the interim benchmarks in the chapters 23 and 24. So the growth plan has not aimed to improve the rule of law and democracy in the Western Balkans, and I am afraid that at some point the European Commission and the European member states will say, you have the growth plan, that's it. That's what we can offer to you. And as you know, the growth plan has four pillars. The first one is this reform agenda, when at some level, during some stage, the Western Balkans can integrate in certain areas of the single European market. The most problematic part is that the common regional market is still part of the growth plan. So if one country, for example, Montenegro, is progressing better than the other countries, Montenegro has to wait for the other countries to integrate within the common regional market. The other thing is that the four agreements which are already signed within the common regional market, they are still not in practice. They are not implementing it because Bosnia and Herzegovina still has not ratified any of our agreements. So basically, I think that the growth plan is kind of alternative to the European integration process, and I am afraid that now we have this encouragement to Montenegro from the European Union's level. We are waiting for this technical report within the chapters 23 and 24, but the thing is that the European Commission and the European Union still does not have any kind of plan, either for Montenegro or for the rest of the Western Balkans, to join the European Union anytime soon. The other thing about Montenegro and how we can speed up the European integration process, we are really in the best position to join the European Union. Like the small country, we cannot destabilize the single European market in economic sense. We also cannot destabilize the European Union in political sense, having I don't know, Hungary and the other far-right countries already being part of the European Union, but it's not easy to, integrate the country which is small and which still has veto right and which has far-right coalition in power. So that's the first issue. The second issue is that Montenegro is really struggling to keep the parliamentary majority and two-third majority for the important reforms in the country when it comes to the rule of law. The other thing is that Montenegro still don't have independent institutions, and you know, like as I said, measuring level of democracy now and 12 years ago when we started negotiations, it's almost the same. So what we managed to do it is still on technical level, fulfilling criteria when it comes to legislative scope. And the European Union at the moment, as I said, trying to speed up the process with Montenegro, is still insisting on laws, on strategies. You know, they're still not insisting on implementation of the laws. And as I said, they have mechanisms to do so. So even if I'm advocating that Montenegro should be this 28-member state, because I already explained, it's small, it's aligned with the common foreign and security policy, there is way for the European Commission to help Montenegro to improve the rule of law. They can do it the same way as they are now helping us to fulfill interim benchmarks within the chapters 23 and 24. They have daily communication with our institutions. They are helping us, you know, they are providing opinions on laws in 2 weeks. And when I was Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of European Affairs, we were waiting for 3 months for that opinion. So there is way for the European Commission and for the European Union to be more involved on the ground and to really be the right mentor for the country to improve the rule of law. And then what's the point of enlargement if enlargement is not happening? You know, enlargement was the most successful policy of the European Union. It was the policy which helped the European Union to be really a great power and to have this transformative power to help countries to build democracy. But now when the European Union has any kind of plan to integrate any country anytime soon, I think that enlargement should be, you know, we can provide different name for enlargement and what is happening within the whole this policy of the European Union. But for us, from the Western Balkans, I think that we should fight for enlargement to be great again. So let's use this Trump's unpopular motto.
Well, I mean, to add a bit on what Jovana said, regarding the growth plan, I think from parliamentary perspective, from the EU perspective, there was 50 billion for Ukraine to make sure that Ukraine survives. It's called a reconstruction plan, but to be honest, as long as the war goes on, it's only for maintaining the country. So we are sending money to have the state in this situation that they can pay teachers and all the civil servants and so on to run the country. But yes, it was watched from the Western Balkan countries, and of course, as I said before, we have the geopolitical players around, and there was also kind of a pressure to do something for the Western Balkan without conditioning this too much. So in the end, for a bureaucrat in the EU institution, it is important that the money is being absorbed by the countries. And if we make it too difficult, if we have all the conditions linked to the accession, I think the EU was also afraid to run into a risk that the 6 billions will not be absorbed and will not be allocated within the certain limit of time. And so we could have had much more conditions, and we could have had much tougher and more, let's say, binding conditions, but that was not being wanted neither by the Council nor by the Commission itself. Second thing, regarding our special envoy for the Western Balkan and my role in the European Parliament, to be honest, I think it is of my conviction to speak out what is necessary to do. In the case of Serbia, I was awarded many times by the president with a person who hated or who hates Serbia as the most. So there was almost in a weekly rhythm given a press conference by the president or by Barnabić or by somebody else only because of my tweets. I mean, come on. You should rule a country and not being obsessed with replying to an individual MEP, telling her what to say or what not to say. Is that helpful? I think sometimes you have to challenge that. Did it make a big difference? I would say in terms of the repeating of the elections now, we could make a difference. But you need a critical majority, and as you said, if you are an individual MEP, it is sometimes hard if you are singled out and being mocked all the time for actually a good reason. But what we need to have for the future is, and that is increasing the case. We have a bigger group of parliamentarians, but also of MPs in the national parliaments who second our message, and to make sure that Vučić does not get away with those accusations. And obviously, I think if we do not have a Hungarian commissioner, I'm very optimistic that we can also have a tougher language on him in the next mandate and also on the progress report. Regarding Manuel, I think he does a good job. He has an executive function. He has not the role of an independent MEP. I mean, our government is much tougher than the Merkel government before. I think we have changed the course a lot regarding the situation we had 2, 3, 4 years ago, but many things are being said behind closed door. That is also not uncommon. I would add on this, or would add to this. And regarding the other countries, I think there is an open door. The problem here is now we see the bilateralization of issues with Bulgaria, with Greece, and these are really minor issues. And when you look into the cases, these are mainly domestic problems. So Greece has a domestic problems, then they come up with a Greek mayor in Albania and pushing this up. Now we saw the resolution in Srebrenica. Serbia's media was obsessed with that. They have not spoken about anything else regarding the election campaign. No transport system, no energy system, nothing. Everything was covered with Srebrenica and the resolution in the UN. The same is true for Greece and this mayor. The same is true for Bulgaria and North Macedonia. So what we see, and that is what I regret very much, that we have not overcome this bilateralization. On the contrary, it's being extended. And this might delay the whole accession process even more and frustrates, of course, candidate countries such as North Macedonia and Albania. There, I would say, we have to overcome the influence of the Council regarding the accession process. We have to make sure, maybe without a change of the treaties, but nevertheless give more competence to the Commission and to, I don't know, the ESS and other actors, and put this bilateralization of the problems at the end of the process, not at the beginning of the process. And here I do understand why countries are super frustrated with the situation as it is.
Richard?
Thank you very much for those remarks, Jovana and Viola. Speaking to Montenegro, and then I'll talk about the European Union, but to Montenegro, back in 2018, my colleagues, Rev Badrovic and Vesko Garcevic and I wrote the comprehensive report on what happened in October 2016, which was essentially an attempted and failed coup d'etat in a state that was, at the time, aspiring to be in part of NATO. If that had happened in the Netherlands or in a Baltic state, then Berlin and Paris and Brussels would be up in arms. But that was not the case in October 2016. And I think that speaks volumes as to the differing treatment between those more quote unquote advanced European states and those that have yet become the hallowed members of the European Union. And we need to keep that in mind because I consider it a prejudice. I also, when I look at Montenegro, I think about the extent to which it is a Russian strategic asset if they can gain it. They have wanted a deep water port in the Adriatic for a long period of time. And that's something that Montenegro offers. And the Russians, like the Chinese, have a very long memory, and they're going to keep going at it. And the fact that this administration in Washington currently, as well as the previous, chose not to prioritize the Balkans, to me suggests an extreme lack of strategic vision about what our adversaries want and what they can get. And I've seen Montenegro going all the way back to when I was still a law student, frankly, in 2001, 2002, focused on Montenegro and recognizing its importance. My hope is that that will be reflected someday in Washington. My greatest hope for the European Union is that there's an ability, and I understand the mechanisms by which this is going to be difficult, but that there's going to be the kind of reform that allows for something less than unanimity when it comes to foreign policy decisions. And I'm so encouraged that that is being talked about in Brussels right now, and that others are behind that, whether it's in the Commission or whether it's in the Parliament in Brussels. I appreciated very much the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and the idea that we need to all be on the same page if we're going to move forward with a policy. That's all good and fine. It ended up in Poland being partitioned between three foreign powers. And I don't know why that is still, I understand the hubris of the 1990s, the West won, everything was great, democracy was going to go forward and all that. But, frankly, between Slovakia, between Hungary, between other states that could very well have like their demos decide something which is in the long term against their interests, that Brussels needs to be prepared and able to say, no, that's not in the interest of European solidarity, unity, and security. And gosh, it would be just fantastic if sometime in the next year or two, we could see Brussels say, you know what, we're not going to have unanimity. That's not going to be the standard. If the majority of us believe that a foreign policy decision is not in our security and our prosperity's interests, then we're going to reject countries like Hungary. We're going to reject countries like Slovakia. Their vote isn't going to count. And that is what really needs to happen if we're going to talk about countries like Montenegro being able to join, without this sort of like, well, we're going to let everyone in the Western Balkans in. Like, no, like you can judge a country by its merits, and that country can join the European Union, and the country can join NATO, as Montenegro already has, without this sort of like greater, like, we need to keep everyone in the Western Balkans happy. You don't. You let countries in on their merits. And that is my greatest hope for the EU. So thanks, Alina.
I would like to ask a question regarding this. Viola, you mentioned that it's a merit-based process, and there is this opinion that if countries move faster, they will be accepted faster. But there are other policymakers who say that everything depends on the EU, and that the EU is not ready. So can you explain a bit what reforms should be done in the EU, how they will be done? And I also heard from some, in particular Polish politicians, that discussions that the EU needs to change the treaty. And it's a very dangerous thing because it will take many, many years. And some say, in particular Polish politicians, that these discussions about the EU need to change the treaty is a German way to say no to enlargement. What do you think as a German politician in Brussels?
But I don't think that especially Germany was insisted on the treaty changes because they are realistic enough to know that there will be no majority for this. There's no appetite for treaty changes at the moment, as bad as it is. So I think France and Germany recently, or some month ago, came up with a pragmatic proposal, and I was actually surprised that nobody really picked it up in the council, that it was not being promoted more, that it was not step by step implemented more. That was exactly to circumvent treaty changes, but to make sure decision makings become easier, and we avoid this constant blocking of Orban with the veto. So the idea, for example, was to have a veto, but only if you find at least two others to join you to veto. That was especially difficult at the beginning because smaller member states are very cautious when it comes to diminishing the right to veto. But I think they understood that the veto right was abused by Orban in a very extensive sense. So to change the right to veto is one opportunity. The second thing is not to enlarge the college anymore. So not to have for each and every country an individual commissioner, but to have a restructuring of the college, to have circulating commissioners, to have, let's say, more a hierarchy of the commission, different competences, but to cluster them a bit more, and to have a board of commissioners for the bigger member states and things like that. So all this was in a proposal, but then the proposal, I don't know, was not really killed by someone, but was also not really discussed in a broader sense. And here you're absolutely right. I expected until the end of our mandate to have something, some progress, to have some reform here. And I'm surprised myself, especially since Macron forced us to do this conference for the future of Europe, and we have done it, and a lot of civil society, a lot of region, everyone participated, and we had, I think, 153 recommendations, and then, again, the council have not picked it up, it's lying somewhere. So yes, on one hand, you are saying, especially Macron was saying that, we need to reform the EU, everyone comes up with proposals, but then there's no driving force in the council. That's why I see that the process of enlargement is a little bit disconnected from the reform process within the European Union. Otherwise, I mean, we speak about 600,000 people and we speak about 1.5 million, for example, in Moldova. We speak about 3 million in North Macedonia. We speak about 3 million, I think, in Albania. So these are numbers we can easily swallow. We have a lot of seats left in the European Parliament. Since the Brits have left, there are 60 seats empty. We can easily fill them with new colleagues from those respective countries. Roberto Metsola, for example, spoke about kind of staged accessions to give them observer status without the full voting rights. So all those interim steps could be possible without having the treaty changed. I'm not too pessimistic, but of course it needs somebody in the council and somebody in the commission who pushes this a bit more than in the past, yes.
Thank you. Do we have some questions from our online participants? I think Ben was checking on this. No? Okay, then let's get some questions here.
Good afternoon, good evening, everyone. My name is Ani Tintsadze, College of Europe. But before asking my question, I should mention that I'm from Georgia, and I'm going to give myself permission to make very quick statement, especially to the last remarks before opening the question and answer session. Based on my working experience in the US Embassy for years and in the NATO Defense College, I can say that I'm very happy that I have never listened any point where it was mentioned that Georgia or Serbia in terms and close to the Serbia is not aligned in the transatlantic area, especially in the NATO. And we should remember that NATO already gave a promise to Georgia to be a member, and after the Bucharest summit, it was a reason that determined our huge contribution in the missions. And once again, Georgia is a second contribution in the NATO missions, for example, in Afghanistan after the France. This is my personal point. The second is that I'm very grateful, and I should mention to every European parliamentary, especially who is presented today with us, that you are not forgetting our people's sacrifice, that we are standing on the streets with two flags, in the EU flag and the US flag, not because that we are waiting for some gain, with economical advantages, etc., only because it's part of our identity. And when I came in the College of Europe, and when people was asking me like how you consider of yourself, I was feeling quite humiliated. Why you should ask me this question? Because our generation is raised on the principles that we are Eastern Europeans, and this is not a part of the question. Of course, I don't want to see my country as the next Hungary or as a like problem in transatlantic affairs. Moreover, like I have ambitions that my generation gonna offer something incredibly big for the EU and for the NATO as well. Now to go to my question and to finish my emotional remark, which is quite understandable based on the current situation, what is happening in Georgia. It is more related to the last decision of the European Union and specifically the pact, what they offered to the Moldova. It is Security and Defense Pact, which is a huge step from the European Union side, despite that from 2020 to 2023 there was a pillar of security and defense resilience increasing in the partner countries and the enlargement representatives. Do you think and do you believe this is a totally new approach which you can offer to the countries where, for example, under the Russian occupation, and we are facing information warfare, or hybrid threats, and etc. And do you believe this Borrell remarks is quite optimistic to see some new geopolitical future of offering something new to these countries? Thank you so much.
Thank you. Can we pick also a few more questions? I see two hands.
Hi, so I'm Anthony Jovana. I work for the Canadian government and I'm also doing my master's at the University of Vienna in International Relations. This is more of a question for Dr. Kraemer. You mentioned like this whole historical context of Russian imperialism and like denying the nationalities of different countries that border Russia during the Russian imperial period, the Soviet era and today. But I guess feel free to answer this question as well, but I'm just not sure if you're allowed to answer this question. Do you think that the West, so the United States, the EU, Canada, the West, do you think we have a moral responsibility to help like the nationalities within the Russian borders, so Chechnya, Angrian Finns, Tatarstan, because to an extent, from a Western perspective, they are oppressed people. And yeah, I just want to hear your thoughts. And I hope there are no Russian spies here. Well, yeah, I just want to hear your thoughts about this.
Very nice question, how we can help Russia to collapse. Do we have a third question? I saw here, yeah, one hand.
Hi, my name is Franca. I have a question also regarding Georgia. I was just recently in your country. It's a very beautiful country. And we were talking about alternative routes. We were talking about clarity of the European Union towards enlargement and alternative routes. Maybe I've heard in certain Georgian scenarios would encompass an association agreement plus. But also in regards to managing expectations and managing identities that are aligned with the European Union. I would ask you what your take is on something between having clarity and having a cutoff and being like, this is not aligned with European values, and from that perspective, which might also lead to frustration, which might lead to already engaging information warfare that could then put these countries into a very precarious situation or turn them over to other forces, I would say. But also talking about expectation management towards if this is not possible, if this is not within the next 20 years, and then foregoing frustration or stagnation.
There was also a question, Julian, just here. Thank you.
Thank you. Firstly, being Ukrainian, I want to voice my support to people of Sakartvelo, to Georgia. And I was really surprised when among Georgian and EU flags, there are also lots of Ukrainian flags in the streets of Tbilisi. I'm so sorry. I have my notes. And now my question. It's fine. So this morning we have partially touched upon the topic about synergy of European and Euro-Atlantic integration. Indeed, some Western Balkan states are already NATO members, but not EU member states yet. At the same time, post-Warsaw Pact countries firstly joined the NATO and then the EU. Do you see in this regard that one integration can potentially accelerate the other one? And do you believe that this statement is still relevant considering the current global geopolitical situation, especially in light of the Russian war against Ukraine, and especially to discuss the Ukrainian case with its European and Euro-Atlantic synergy? Thank you.
Very interesting question, I would say. Let us start. Who wants to start? Richard, yeah, maybe you want to start.
Sure, I'll respond to thank you very much, Alina, and I'll respond to those two questions, one regarding Georgia, and then more broadly about those ethnicities that have found themselves to be placed by misfortune on the borders of an imperialist Russia. I don't contend to be a Georgian expert. I don't speak Georgian, and I consider that to be like pretty fundamental if you're going to really know what's going on in a country. But having said that, what I have seen from public opinion polls is that there's a very urban-rural split in terms of those individuals, those Georgian citizens that that look westward, they want to be part of the NATO, they want to be part of the European Union, and those that are in rural settings. And my hope and my wish is that for Georgian civil society to reach out to those Georgian citizens, their compatriots more so, and less, obviously, the support from the West is key, and it's so encouraging. It's so inspiring to see so many Georgians turn out in the streets and say, look, our independent civil society is so important. We're going to get beaten. We're going to get arrested. We're going to be clubbed in order to protect it. Like that, this isn't actually taking up more of the sort of news bandwidth right now in the West is disappointing to me and frankly a little shocking. So, please keep on keeping on, as they used to say in the 1970s, but also recognize, to the extent that civil society in Georgia may, that there is a significant constituency in your country that votes for Georgia Dream, and their opinions need to be changed, and it's up to democratic civil society in Georgia to do it, as hard as that may be. So that leads me to those non-Russian ethnicities that have been on the border of that imperial country for centuries. Look, I used to work for the National Endowment for Democracy. I worked for the National Endowment for Democracy almost like 10 years. So, my opinions, my perspective on this is going to be shaded accordingly. But, when it comes down to it, it was in 1948, I believe, that all the nations of the world came together under the aegis of the UN and said, these are fundamental rights that everyone should have. And it's both inspiring and a little amazing to me that it took centuries for all the nations, all the states of the world to get together and say, all right, you know what, if you're a human being, you get entitled these things. And certainly one of them is freedom of speech, freedom of belief. And what extends from that is your ability to decide what your sovereign is going to be. Now, I appreciate the geopolitical limitations, why the English, can't have their own country, or the Chechens can't have their own country, what have you. The Balkash, the Yakuts, there are so many peoples. But fundamentally, if you have the majority of people in a given land space that want to govern themselves, then we should support that as Americans. And I think that foreign policy is very complicated. It can be very tricky. I indicated previously that it's a lot easier to criticize than actually be in the position of making decisions and making them realized. But nonetheless, the principle is still that if you're part of a community and you identify distinctly from those that are governing you, then you should be able to make a case as to why you should govern yourselves. And that was the argument that I made for Montenegro back in a 67-page paper that I wrote in law school, and it still adheres. I very much am a belief that those that identify themselves as distinct should be able to govern themselves in pursuit of their sovereignty, in pursuit of their security and prosperity.
Richard, NATO, EU membership for countries who are not members who aspire to be, very briefly, how you see it, how it will happen?
One more time, please.
NATO, EU membership for countries who aspire to be members and are not yet members, how do you see it will happen?
Oh, goodness. I mean, I am a bit sympathetic. There was a promise unfulfilled. Let's take Georgia as an example. When a country is basically in a Cold War, when its territory has been occupied by a foreign power, it's very difficult vis-a-vis Chapter 5 to say, okay, come on board, because essentially your NATO member states are then opening themselves up to having engaged in a conflict. And I think we need to be very real about that. NATO has somehow managed to get past that because we're looking at 3 countries, Moldova, Ukraine, and Georgia, that all of which are occupied by a common adversary, and that is Russia. That's the Russian Federation. One, I think that there needs to be the political understanding and recognition by NATO member states that we essentially are, again, in a Cold War. And, it's being fought by different means. It's being fought economically. It's being fought in respect to disinformation. It's being fought politically to the extent that Russians try to actually buy influence in Western democracies, and so on and so forth. So to not talk about it as a Cold War at this juncture, to me, that individual is not looking at reality. So if we're going to accept that premise, that essentially Russia is an adversary and we're in a Cold War with them, then the NATO standards for who gets to be part of the membership and who doesn't needs to shift. And I've been encouraged to see that's happening with Georgia and Moldova and Ukraine, all countries of which are occupied, part of their territory is occupied by a foreign power, yet nonetheless, we're moving towards that. That's where we need to go. And to say that a country, concerns about Chapter 5 and a country that may have part of its territory occupied, you're not helping that country actually come into the West. What you're doing is relegating them to what is going to be either the status quo from those, say, German or French elites that want to just keep doing business with Russia as usual, or you're leaving them to have a country that is less than complete, and that allows for irredentists, that allows for corruption, that allows for all kinds of means by which the Russians seek to prevent these peoples from being able to realize what they see as their own destiny, which is one that is democratic and one that is comparatively free market oriented.
Thank you.
Regarding Georgia, to be honest, of course, I don't speak Georgian, but I've spent quite a lot of time in Georgia and it's very close to my heart. So there was not a huge political will to grant the candidate status to Georgia at the very beginning. And to be honest, I was fighting hard amongst my colleagues in the Bundestag, in the German government, but also in the parliament, especially also in those countries, who were close to the former president Saakashvili. They did not want to give anything to GG. And I said, well, there are 85% of the people in the country who really would like to see themselves in the West, in the EU, in NATO. You see the obligation in the constitution you hardly find in any other country. So I think what we should do is grant the candidate status on certain conditions and make sure there is like a referendum on the 26th of October, so the upcoming legislative elections, and make sure we can at least have free, fair, integer and transparent elections, and people understand if you vote for GD, there's no EU option. If you vote for any other party, you might end up in the European Union. But what happened now is, of course, GD took these harsh measures now against the civil society, against any election, domestic election observation groups who might guarantee this free and fair and transparent elections, that what I had in mind when we were promoting for the candidate status, this referendum might not even take place, because many of those IFSET and transparency and many other bigger civil society groups in Georgia might have to cut off their finances, might have to even I don't know, sign off until October. So we are in a big dilemma. On one hand, GD takes the whole country hostage, but on the other hand, they still claim that they want to make, or that they want to campaign on this candidate status, which they have not deserved and which they have not earned, but they take it for granted. So we are in a super dilemma situation. And I was super happy yesterday when I read this Blinken statement. The US State Department finally decided to have a very restrictive visa regime policy for the leadership of Georgian Dream. I think this is the right measure. We need targeted sanction on those who are responsible. And EU, again, is of course, I will not come up with anything. I've heard from inside, from the European External Action Service, but also from Commission, that Hungary will block everything. So here we need a lot of pressure from the European Parliament, but I'm sitting here, we are campaigning, we're not in Brussels, we are not around, we are not pushing, we are like a lame duck. And Georgian Dream knows that. And so I think in this very moment, Georgian Dream, Bidzina Ivanishvili took the right time to move forward with his very, very harsh measures against the independent civil society. And I'm very much afraid that the plan we had in mind to have a new government, hopefully after the 26th of October, will be increasingly difficult to keep up. Let's wait and see. I still think it was the right decision to grant the candidate status. I hope that we can continue with the civil society and the active citizens and the new generation, but I see there's a lot of exhausting now. I mean, people were out on the streets for a month now, they gave everything, and the EU did not mirror this. The EU came not up with the right response to this. And here I can see, we will see this similar frustration as we have seen in the case of Serbia and others. So will we have a similar mission, what we have now, or what we had implemented in Moldova? I can't tell you, because Moldova is a special case. It's very small, it's super cooperative with the EU. It really goes hand in hand. The cooperation between the government and all respective institution of Moldova with the EU institution is super, super close. Plus, the council really backs everything. In the case of Georgia, is completely different, for example. Some member states, such as France, say, well, Georgia is not even Europe, what you're talking about, and there is not a general, let's say, acknowledgement that Georgia should have the chance to enter the European Union, even if it is a merit-based process. I know that's very hard, but this is the common thinking, and so I see there's a big discrepancy between the situation, for example, in Moldova at the moment and the situation in Georgia, unfortunately.
In order to help Ukraine, this question about Moldova agreement, security agreement with the European Union, in order to help Ukraine, and the European Union already integrated Ukraine in some areas of the single European market. And then we from the Western Balkans and the rest with candidate status, we were complaining that why should we are not getting the same as Ukraine is getting. So what I'm trying to say, it's good to have this kind of agreements for closer cooperation. It's good that the European Union is improving its policy towards the candidate countries. But if there is no perspective, European perspective for all of these countries, I think that all of these agreements can have their limits. So in that sense, it's good, but it has its limits. The other thing about a situation in Georgia and what is happening there, there was one comment or post on X during the protest, poor people, you really want to be part of the European Union, but the European Union does not want you. And that's the way, you know, that explains everything. The European Union has to change its approach, and the European Union has to really show to the candidate status that it really wants them to be part of Europe and the European Union. And then finally on NATO and the EU, whether the membership in the NATO is a precondition for joining the European Union, I had a chance to discuss these issues with a professor from the Faculty of Political Sciences in Zagreb, and his thesis was that Radovan Vukadinović, and his thesis was that the NATO membership is precondition for EU membership, because that was the case in the past, during the previous enlargement waves. But when it comes to the Western Balkans, this is not the case as for all the other, issues and questions, because Albania joined the NATO a long time ago. Montenegro joined NATO in 2017. Whether the situation in Montenegro is better when it comes to security, maybe in global and general sense. Whether the situation is better in the country when it comes to the rule of law and the rule of law criteria, it's not. Whether we are progressing towards the European Union, I still don't know. So it's good to have this kind of insecurity sense that NATO is securing, and if one country is attacking another, but that's all what NATO secures, If one country is attacking you, NATO will protect you, and that's basically it. So I'm not sure whether it's preconditioned, but it's good that in terms of having Western values in all Western Balkan countries, is good that all of them to be part of NATO, and then later to be part of the European Union, except for Serbia, of course, because Serbia does not want to be part of NATO.
Do we have the last question? No? No one?
But just one moment. Regarding NATO and Serbia, it's interesting. If you speak with NATO representatives about Serbia, they say the generals and the military cooperates absolutely well. Let's say the technical level, and also on the leadership level, the Serbian generals and the whole, I don't know how you call this, leadership of the army is fully in line with NATO, and that is not as, let's say, negative and as distant as it's always portrayed. Just to.
The last question. Do we have any question? No. Okay. Then your concluding remarks. Richard, do you want to start with concluding? Just very briefly. How do you see enlargement? Are you optimist or pessimist?
Okay, yeah, thank you for giving me at least like some kind of lead on that one. I'm like, oh gosh, what am I going to say? First off, this has been a great panel, and Viola and Jovana, it's, sorry I had to meet you virtually, but I think if I may dare so project, we're largely on the same page about the trajectory that we'd like to see Europe be in. And we have our opinions, essentially that there's a lot of opportunity here. And I fundamentally believe that, with one large exception, that being the Russian Federation and to a certain degree Belarus, but by and large, we've seen from years of engagement in countries in Southeastern and Central Eastern Europe that they want to be part of a transatlantic alliance. And I think that it's in our interest, as well as, to a certain degree, it's our duty to help those people realize their ambitions. If the majority of a country wants to see themselves as free and independent and sovereign, then we're in a position to help them realize that ambition. We should be doing it, and I'm encouraged about the future right now. As violent as it may be, we're seeing people wanting to realize their own dreams, and I think that's great, and we should be part of it.
Thank you, Jovana.
Let's pick like 3 recommendations both for the European Union and enlargement. For the European Union, I think that the European Parliament should have more power in the EU institutional system. Citizens of the European Union should have more influence on decision making. And the third point is to introduce qualified majority voting for enlargement process from moving to one stage to another, because this does not guarantee that the country will become the part of the European Union, but certainly will speed up the process and have better dynamics when it comes to reforms in the candidate countries. When it comes to the Western Balkans and candidate countries in general, I think that there should be clear plan for the countries, political plan, and for example, to have roadmaps for each of them by 2030, what is possible to achieve in every of the countries by 2030. For Montenegro, most probably it is possible to join the European by 2030, but it's really important to have clear vision for all the countries. The other thing is that for the Western Balkans, and because I'm using this Western Balkans because the rule of law mechanism, the rule of law which is implemented in the European Union currently, there is rule of law mechanisms also implemented in North Macedonia, in Albania and Montenegro. It's really important to use this mechanism with obligatory recommendations because, you know, in order to have and to monitor whether situation is improving in the countries, you have to have clear recommendations and you have to provide follow-up mechanism. This is something which can be used in the Western Balkans and also to improve situation in the EU member states. That's the second recommendation. And third recommendation, it's actually, you know, really to make a merit-based system to work in practice. And in order to do so, you have to implement both incentives and sanctions. So I truly believe that by sanctioning non-democratic practice, you can, you know, show to the rest of the countries how you really care about values and about democracy.
Well, I hope that the EU decides at one point not just talk the talk, but also walk the walk, and that I'm realistic, but hopeful that the merit-based process, which at some point we really demand them, but then we do not use our sticks. We don't use, as you said, we give sometimes incentives, but if the incentives are not big enough or if they're not taken, we give the money anyway. And so we give then, or we give the wrong incentives in that sense, and we do not use our leverage, our sticks. Germany, for example, or the German industry has created 82,000 jobs only in Serbia, and that is mainly the economical ground, the economical base for Vucic's power, but instead of using that, we go on with promoting Serbia as an investment place. So here I think we are not coherent enough. We do not use this potential for political reason, for transformative reason. The last plenary day in Strasbourg, the 25th of April, we had a very nice celebration of the 20 years of enlargement. And one thing is clear, everyone who stood up and reminded us of the transformative power of the EU has said without the enlargement, all the Baltic countries, neither Cyprus nor the Central European states had never reformed. So this attractiveness of the EU has maybe not the same, let's say, or is not in the... is not as attractive as it was 20 years ago, but nevertheless, in terms of Ukraine and Moldova, it's still there, and even the Western Balkan, we can use that. But if we are not coherent, if we have people like Faheli and others who spoil the whole process, we are not credible, we lose power, we lose influence, and I do hope we can have a reset button once again after the 9th of June.
On this note, on a hope, we are finishing our first panel. Thank you so much for our speakers. I think we had very interesting discussion. Thank you for the public, online and offline. Now we will have a break and then we'll have the next panel. Thank you so much.